This is a presentation of John Michelle made by Jun Chen and Johnson. This is a picture of him. John Michel's early life. In a log cabin in Germantown, a rural community on the Virginia frontier close to present-day New Midland, Fauquier County. In the mid-1760s, the Michel moved west to the present-day site of Markham, Virginia. His parents were Thomas Michel and Mary Randolph Keith, the granddaughter of politician Thomas Randolph of Tuckahoe and the second cousin of United States President. John Michel's education. From a young age, Michel was noted for his good humor and black eyes, which were strong and penetrating, beaming with intelligence and good nature, with the exception of 1 year of formal schooling, during which time he befriended future President James Monroe. John Michel did not receive a formal education. Encouraged by his parents, the young Michel read widely, reading works such as William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man. John Michel's political life. John Michel is the most admired talent of George Washington, the father of the United States. He is a loyal Federalist and advocates a strong federal government. He believes that state rights should be under the control of the federal government and should even be integrated into one. At the same time, he was also a close ally of second President of the United States, Adams. In 1797, a contradiction broke out between the United States and France. Michel, as a minister, sent France to the gap between the other nations, but only hoped. Many descendants believe that Michel, and in September 1948, George Washington personally lobbied Michel to participate in the parliamentary elections. In the election, Michel defeated and, like Adams, firmly believed that Britain is the most reliable ally of the United States and hostile to France. Therefore, this task is not fully implemented. In Michel's political career, Washington has always been his spiritual master and role model. The third President of the United States, Jefferson, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, is the natural enemy of Michel. In fact, the two were cousins of distant houses. They all studied law at William and Mary College, and they were also the founding fathers. They also served as Adams' government. The Democratic Republican Jefferson is an active advocate of state power, and the state governments should be on an equal footing with the federal government. Michel is extremely opposite. The two men have never been in the same life. The battle between Michel and Jefferson is the most famous partisanship in American history. Many historical events affecting the constitutional structure of the United States have taken place under their directions. In the end, those two people with completely different political ideas have joined forces to create the basic constitutional structure of the United States. The strict federal government and independent judiciary and shaped in their long-lasting fighting. Although Jefferson and Michel have never been friends, they are generally believed to have insisted on their own ideals, which allowed the American political system to mature, and their contributions will always be remembered. It is worth mentioning that in the later years after Jefferson's withdrawal from politics, the Federal Party has disintegrated, but Michel has become a mythical figure in American justice, and even the Democratic Republican judges of the Supreme Court are also all of him. This is a picture of Jefferson and Michelle. Let's head into the court case New York Times against United States. This court case was happening in 1971. Petition was New York Times Company and response was the United States. By 1971, the United States, although never having declared war, had been engaged in a war with North Vietnam for 6 years. At this point, about 58,000 American soldiers had died and the government was facing widespread dissent from large portion of the American public. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert commissioned a massive top-secret history of the United States role in Indochina. Daniel Ellsberg, who had helped to produce the report, leaked 43 volumes of the 47-volume, 7,000-page report to reporter Neil Sheehan of the New York Times in March 1971, and the paper began publishing articles outlining the findings. On June 18, 1971, the Washington Post began publishing its own series of articles based upon the Pentagon Papers. That day, consistent United States Attorney General William Rehnquist asked the Post to cease publication of the paper refused. Rehnquist sought an injunction in the District Court for the District of Columbia, but Judge Gerhard Gisel rejected the government's request, as did the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. This inconsistency between the courts of appeal led the Supreme Court to hear the case. On June 30th, with 6 justices concurring and 3 dissenting, the Supreme Court upheld the right of the newspapers to publish the material. The court issued a very brief per curiam option, stating only that the court concurred with the decisions of the 2 lower courts to reject the government's request for an injunction. In its decision, the court first established the legal question with the use of precedents. It first stated that any system of prior restraint of expression comes to this court bearing a heavy presumptions. Against its constitutional validity, the purpose of this statement was to make the presence of the inherent conflict between the government's efforts and the First Amendment clear. The decision then stated that government thus carries a heavy burden of showing justification for the imposition of such a restraint. This reinforced the idea that it was Nixon administration's responsibility to show sufficient evidence that the newspaper's actions would cause a grave and irreparable danger. New York Times against the United States is generally considered a victory for an extensive reading of the First Amendment, but as the Supreme Court ruled on whether the government had made a successful case for prior restraint, its decision did not void the Espionage Act or give the press unlimited freedom to publish classified documents. Thanks for listening to my presentation. That's it.